So thank you all so much. We are thrilled to be hosting this event, Writing the West, on Independent Bookstore Day. We have with us Lauren Francis-Sharma, Reyna Grande, and Rishi Reddi. And our moderator today is Tamika, who's a bookseller at Bookstore in Los Angeles. So thank you all so much. Happy Independent Bookstore Day. And I just want to let everybody know that books by all of these authors are, of course, available at your local independent bookstore. And if you can't make it there in person, they're available online. Today's a great day to go to a bookstore because everybody is celebrating. And please, if you have any questions, use the Q&A function on Zoom there, and Tamika will moderate those as we go. So thanks so much, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Samantha. Hi again, my name is Tamika Blackshear. I am the assistant store manager at Bookstore in West Hollywood. I am very excited to be here today to speak with you all. I wanted to take a moment before we started to just acknowledge the state of current events, and to just honor just the heaviness and the weight of this year. And, you know, to ensure that this will be like a pocket of joy amongst so much ongoing sorrow with just everything that's happening. If you're up to date on any sort of news, you know that there's a lot of people hurting, but we want to be able to be in positions to create those pockets of joy and community, and to just be there for one another. So I wanted to take a moment to honor that, because there's just so much going on, and it makes it harder to smile at times, but we we persevere and we survive. And that's one of the things that I got the most interacting with all of the works of our lovely panelists today, is that, you know, we survive, and not only do we survive, we thrive on the other end, and we can learn a lot from each other's stories, and regardless of whatever situation that we're going through, we have the strength within ourselves to kind of push through it. So yeah, I wanted to say that. And then I just wanted to welcome all of the authors, and thank the ABA for hosting this discussion, this Writing in the West panel discussion. If we could, I would like to have all of the authors introduce themselves and maybe briefly tell us about your work. Also tell us where you're recording from. I've been watching a lot of Zooms throughout the course of quarantine, and I find it interesting where people choose to record their Zooms. So if you could share with us where you're recording from, or what type of thought you put into where you were recording, anything like that, that'd be really cool. Maybe starting with Lauren.
Sure, yeah. I'm Lauren Francis-Sharma, and my latest book is Book of the Little Axe, set partially in Trinidad and partially in what will become Montana in the 1800s. Where am I recording from? I'm in my home in Maryland, the suburbs of Maryland, right outside of DC. And when COVID started and my book launched in May, I had to sort of repurpose a whole new room. So I got kicked out of my official office because my husband needed to be on very loud conference calls. And so I moved into another room in our house, and we set up another desk. So you're looking behind me at sort of a room that never was used before COVID. So it's working out all right.
Reyna?
Yeah, hello. I am in Woodland, California, just like 20 minutes outside of Sacramento. And it's been very hot. We have very, very hot summers, unfortunately. And then with the fires, the air quality has been terrible. So I have been inside my house for about a week and a half, not really coming out that much because it was raining ash at some point. So my car is covered in ash. I haven't washed it yet. And so are my plants. I need to give my plants a bath because they're all covered in ash too. But I am in my office. I have my own office, and everybody seems to like hanging out here with me. So my kids are constantly coming in and out of my office. My dog is always in my office, even though when I'm not in my office, my dog is in here waiting for me to come back. So it's been kind of nice to be in here because I've actually gotten a lot of writing done in a way I've never had before. Never. It's been incredible how much writing I have done in this last few months. So I'm grateful about that.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your upcoming novel?
Yeah. I know this is a fiction panel, and for some reason my memoir was on the advertisement on the poster for this, and I guess it's because I guess more people have read my memoirs than they have read my novels. But I decided to take a break on the memoir writing and go back to my first love, which was fiction, you know. So I'm finally writing a novel. I haven't published a novel since 2009. So it's kind of nice to finally be working on fiction, working on a novel, and to have this as my next project. And the novel that I decided to tackle after all these years of not writing fiction is a historical novel that is set during the Mexican-American War. And it takes place from 1846 to 1848. And I wanted to write about this war because it has been overshadowed by the Civil War. It seems that, you know, in school, kids don't learn about the Mexican-American War. All the emphasis is placed on the Civil War, but I really feel that learning about the Mexican-American War would help people understand how all this conflict and the relationship that we have with Mexico, how it was so deeply impacted by what happened in the 1840s when the United States took almost half of Mexico's territory and made it its own. So I really wanted to write a novel that would help people think about, you know, the place of Mexicans in this country and the very complex and complicated relationship that the U.S. and Mexico have and have had ever since the 1840s.
Amazing. Rishi, do you want to tell us a little bit about your novel and where you're recording from in your COVID situation?
Yeah, I'm coming to you from Plymouth, Massachusetts, in the basement of my parents' home. And my daughter just helped me put up this shield here so you cannot see the travesty that is on the other side of this, with this little Indian scarf, you know, for some flair. And she said it was okay to wear this purple shirt with the orange. So
Good. That was good advice.
It's great.
And unlike Reyna, I'm beyond the age where the kids want to come into my office, but the dog is right here next to me. So, you can hear him. So I wrote the book that I wrote, Passage West, is set clear across to the other end of the country in Imperial Valley, Southern California, on the border with Mexico. So there was a lot of research involved and traveling involved in trying to find out more about that population and the cities and towns and folks that I was writing about. So I'm very far away from it all and from you guys out west right now.
One of the things that I thought about as soon as I got the invite to moderate was this concept of the West, and even the language that we use when we talk about the West, and how even in its wording, it feels very like colonialists, just the idea of the West and how you don't really hear very many stories of origin prior to an invasion or a war or something like that. So in all of your stories, I like was really latching on to this existence of life prior to colonization and prior to the British showing up or the Spanish showing up or all of those elements. And I feel like that idea in itself is embedded in the word itself, the West, in that romanticized idea of the West. So my question would be, is what is your relationship to this idea of the West, especially coming from narratives that you all have that include people that existed and had lives and livelihoods and families and communities prior to colonization and what we know of the West today?
Yeah. Well, I'll jump in. Yeah, you know, I remember when I decided to write this story, I was at a writer's residence, and I had sort of mentioned to the other, you know, people who were there that I was sort of embarking on this writing about, you know, a Western, so to speak, and I was sort of pulled aside by one of the people there, the residents, who started to ask me if I really knew what a Western was, right? And he started to sort of, well, you know, have you read McMurtry and have you read McCarthy? And I was sort of like, well, yeah, you know, and I didn't actually realize what he was intimating until I was walking back to sort of my residence, and I was like, wait, I think he's questioning whether or not I can write this story and whether I'm allowed to write a story about the West and putting people who look different from the normal narratives of the West. And so I was really sort of shocked, but also sort of buoyed by by this opportunity, so to speak. I mean, you know, my story, you know, has a duality to it, and much like Rishi's and Reyna's. But, you know, there is a sense of people kind of moving from one place, a home. You know, in my case, my character is from Trinidad. And, you know, what I found interesting was that when I was doing my research and I was sort of creating this story, I was doing my research, I found people who look like me who were already there. And I hadn't known that. And so, you know, I folded one of those characters into my book. And I also, you know, gave I think a lot of space to Indigenous people who, you know, who'd actually been there before my character showed up. And so for me, writing a Western was not going to look like sort of what I'd read Westerns before. Like, you know, it wasn't going to be sort of this lone guy and, you know, this fight against the land. And, you know, for me, it was going to be about community. And you know, prior community and building community. And, you know, I was very insistent that it didn't forget women because often that happens. And so I was going to center more women in my story, and particularly one woman. And, you know, and it was also going to be this embracing of the land, and as opposed to some oppositionality to the land. And so those were sort of the things that really drove me to want to sort of write a Western that didn't feel like the norm, but encompassed all the things that I guess, as you mentioned, Tamika, sort of you think about the West in sort of this vast sort of exploration kind of way. But anyway.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying, Lauren. And I'm really glad that you're writing about the West, because it's true, like while I've been doing research about my novel, almost every book, every novel I've read is written by a man, and they're so violent, and the few female protagonists in those novels are all prostitutes. So I really do think that more women need to write historical fiction. We need to tackle, you know, these experiences in a way that we need to move away from the way men usually write about these these topics. So that's something that I'm really happy about, is to write a novel that is not unnecessarily violent, and where women are not prostitutes, and where, you know, they have more, there's more at stake in the book. And I want to really bring out women and how they help to shape the West.
So to me, Tamika, you've asked a very loaded question, because the concept of the West was really something that was braided into this work in two notions. The West in the way that people from South Asia speak of the West. I mean, that is a loaded term. The West is urban. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the truth. I'm saying what the term is loaded with. It's urban, it's modern, it's advanced, it's cold. It's both, you know, desired and reviled, simultaneously at the same time. And then there is this notion in the US of the West as being California, the gold that we all went out there for, you know, the guns, the cowboys who are invariably all white, even though they weren't. And so I very much wanted to have the word West in my title. And I went back and forth with my publishing house about this. There was a little bit of tension there around the use of the word West and how it would appear in the title. And there was a little bit of pressure, you know, about perhaps not having it in there. Landed on this title, Passage West, which is sort of a replay of Passage to India, which is, you know, travel in a different direction. So how West plays itself out in the novel is something that I think has sort of spiraling meanings towards each other. You both have brought up this very interesting topic about writing about women in the West, which I really struggled with. It's a friendship between two men, Ram and Karak, that I'm writing about. And the great many South Asian immigrants who came at that time in 1910 were men. I mean, I think there were 4 South Asian women who were there at the time. So I really struggled with how was I going to depict Indian women, South Asian women in the landscape then. And, you know, I don't know, I made certain choices, but I fully agree with what the two of you are saying there about the women's story really not being told in the mythologized American West as we read it, you know, in the great many novels that we read now.
I will say, Rishi, I thought you did a really lovely job of incorporating the letters and the letter writing from, you know, back home into your story. So in some respects, I felt like Padma was a very big part of the story for me. And so even if she's not physically in the West, like you incorporated her very nicely, so.
Thank you, Lauren. I mean, the letters to me were a way, you know, letters along in those long distances in that era, you know, 6 weeks traveling each way, you know, the conversation takes 12 weeks to have. That is what the relationship is. The relationship is off that piece of paper. You know, that was part of the West, you know, in that era, the Pony Express and the way that people spoke to each other. I mean, as Reyna is bringing up, it was not all about violence and the one gun that presents itself in chapter 2 that gets shot in chapter 20. You know, there's a lot more there. So.
Yeah.
I think this whole conversation just illuminates further how shadowed and deeply biased history is. And I wondered how you feel as like writing these historical fictions. I feel like you all are like investigative journalists in a lot of ways, and you're uncovering these moments in history that have, like what Reyna said, we have these complicated relationships amongst each other, and the history that we're taught is so incredibly biased and fashioned to the point where it's like you look at
one-sided.
Right, one-sided. You look at a timeline of history and there's it spans 500 years and there's all these gaps where they stop. at certain years. And it's like, what's in between those gaps? And how do we get from this place to this place? And
Yeah.
so you all are really doing this work because a lot of that history has been hidden. And even in the fiction stories, you're illuminating these areas that very well could have, that could have happened, and while intertwining actual character, actual like people who existed in real life. Do you feel as though, like, do you feel that burden of just filling in those blanks of history for us all, and moving us forward where we should be as far as our understanding of ourselves and our relationship to each other and to the land?
Yeah, yeah. I do. I feel it, and I also feel it as much more of an opportunity. I mean, in some respects, the landscape was wide open, you know, for me to be able to write this kind of story. You know, when I think about sort of facts, and I actually wrote a piece about this for Electric Lit, but you know, I remember listening to Hilary Mantel sort of talk about like the facts leading you to certain places and allowing you to sort of, you know, historical fiction and allowing you to kind of weave your story, but you have to weave it around facts. And I remember listening to her lecture and thinking to myself, but wait, what if people were writing about people who look like me in ways that are not factually correct, or not even writing about people like me? Like, what if it's completely blank? And, you know, and when I was doing my research, what I was finding was all these letters written from sort of colonists in the Caribbean back home to Europe. And, you know, there'd be like census material, and you would see sort of enslaved Africans and the number of free people of color and the number of indigenous people, you know, on the islands. And then, you know, but then all you were getting were these letters from these white men writing back home about how hot it was or how difficult it was, and et cetera, et cetera. And there was just this huge open wide gap of opportunity, because I knew that there were free people of color in Trinidad. And I knew that that there were families, you know, broken and together, and, you know, there were stories there. I mean, it was so many stories. And, you know, what I decided to do was fictionalize. I mean, you said it really well, Tamika, but I fictionalized something that I really believed could have existed based on, you know, the materials, the few materials that I found. But, you know, to me, the whole idea of facts, particularly for people of color, when we're talking about a history written by white men, I don't know what facts mean, you know. You know, and I worked around as much as I could find, but in some respects, I was, yes, investigating and digging very, very hard to find material that may have existed, may have not existed. I mean, you know, I sort of, it was a weaving, you know, it was a real weaving and quilting that was going on, of the little drops of information, and trying to piece that together without completely thwarting the facts, but also understanding that that there were things that were written. For instance, I have a character, Edward Rose, who's a real historical, he was, you know, a guide for explorers, and he was Black, and he was also Crow Native American chief. And there wasn't very much written about Edward Rose, and what was written was extremely disparaging about him. There was this, you know, this idea that he was, you know, untrustworthy, and he was a scoundrel, and yet the men were coming year after year paying him to take them westward. So you're entrusting your lives with this man that you don't think is trustworthy. And something about that just didn't click for me. And I'm thinking to myself, well, something about this story doesn't work, right? You're writing back home, this is, you know, this very untrustworthy Black man, and yet you're continuing to follow him with your with your money, your goods, your furs, and all that. So so that really, that kind of made me realize there was so much more behind those words.
You know, Lauren, there's something about that strikes me, that part of the depiction of him as untrustworthy is also, it's a expression of the resentment of having to depend on him.
Yeah.
You know, the resentment of that, like, I can't do this. I wouldn't be able to do it on my own. So I have to depict you. You know, I'm saying this subconsciously, not like, you know,
Right.
that
Yeah.
this equals that. But, that is what's, your mind has to do something with that.
Right. But then that becomes the record, right?
That becomes the record, right? Because you're writing the record, because you get to write the record. Yeah.
Right.
I'm thinking about Reyna, about the preview that you sent for your new novel, and the Irish characters, and what type of investigation you had to do in order to like embody that character. These men who came over just to fight in our wars.
Yeah, that has been really interesting for me. And that's actually one of the reasons why I started writing this novel, was that I was really intrigued by this group of Irishmen who deserted the US Army, and they switched sides to fight for Mexico. And it's interesting to me because in the US, we never talk about them. And the few times that we do, they're called the Irish traitors. Whereas in Mexico, they're considered heroes. And every year in September, there's a parade to honor their memory. And it's really interesting, right? This dichotomy of like being a traitor, being a hero. And I did a lot of research about these Irish deserters who fought in the Mexican army. And my protagonist, he's a real historical figure. So I was able to get a lot of information about him. And that has been, to me, it's been really interesting to see how nowadays, the Irish here, they're considered white. They're part of, they're white and they have white privilege. But then back in the 1840s, they were considered the most unwanted group of immigrants. They were considered drunk and lazy, and they were not wanted, and they were severely discriminated against in a way that Mexican immigrants are discriminated today. That was the kind of discrimination that the Irish experienced when they first came. And that's part of the reason why they deserted the US Army, because of that discrimination, the severe punishments that they would receive at the hands of their commanding officers. And then also they were discriminated because they were Catholic. So religion had a big role to play in that. And of course, part of the reason why they went over to Mexico was because Mexico is a Catholic nation, and they feel more connected to Mexico than they did to the US. So my book is told in 2 points of view. It's my Irish soldier. I write about, his decision to desert the US Army and switch sides to fight for Mexico. And he ends up recruiting a lot of his countrymen, and he creates a battalion. It's called the St. Patrick's Battalion. And it was exclusively made of deserters from the US Army. And my other character is a Mexican woman who volunteers as a nurse in the Mexican Army, and that's how they meet. And it's a love story. So there's a love story, it's a war story, it's an immigrant story. And of course, the Irish at the end, they were hanged, and it's the largest hanging in US history, and we never talk about it. So it's a very interesting topic that I'm writing about. And of course, we're talking about the West. This is literally the time when the western part of the United States was created. It was because of this war. It was at the end of this war that the United States acquired, California, Phoenix, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. So parts of Colorado and parts of Utah and parts of Wyoming. This is the West. This is manifest destiny. This was the time of manifest destiny. And at the end of this war, the United States took so much of Mexico's land. And to me, it has been interesting to see the parallels between what's going on today in regards to this anti-immigrant sentiments especially the way, you know, the Mexican immigrant, the Latino immigrant has been so mistreated and discriminated against. And then comparing that to the way the Irish immigrant was discriminated against back in the 1840s. And also thinking about, you know, what was going on in Ireland at the time, the potato famine, you know, that killed over 1 million people. And there was so much immigration going on because people were starving. So many Irish had to leave their homes. So I try to capture that experience of forced migration and, you know, what it's like to have to leave your family behind. Kind of, Rishi, you know, you write about that, about your character having to leave his wife and child behind. So I write about that as well in my book, about separated families, the way immigration affects families, and the price that immigrants pay for the American dream.
Wow. Can I just say, like, historical fiction is amazing.
It is.
It's so much
work, though.
It's a lot of work. But I mean, you know, listening to you, Reyna, I want that book like right now. Right?
I had the same reaction. I was like, wow, I can't wait to read that.
Yeah.
I would not say I'm an avid historical fiction reader, but after reading the works from you three, I was like, should I rethink this? Because I feel like I'm learning more about the land in which I live on currently than I ever have in any form of education. And I mean, at this, where we are as a culture and in a society right now, people are thirsty for your stories. It feels like the veil has been lifted, and so many of what we thought to be true has been disproven. And not only disproven, but the proof lies within our own DNA about what the real stories were. And they just haven't been explained to us, but people are thirsty for that knowledge and need to come to a more understanding so we can. I think your stories are like the foundation for the empathy that we need in this country in order to be able to like move forward. Even in like thinking about Rishi's story and how people were just denied rights and land, and it was taken up to such high levels of like Supreme Court and stuff like that. So it's like these are things that I never knew and I never learned. And to find out that those things were based in like facts and be like, okay, how much it's really encouraging. It's extremely inspiring, and I think it's deeply necessary. The type of research that you all are doing. And I know, I wonder, have you ever received any like sort of thank yous or any revelations from your readers that have like stuck with you after writing your works? Have you gotten maybe any contact from other Mexican Americans, Reyna, or I know tons of people from Trinidad and Tobago, because I grew up in the East Coast. So I grew up in like Philly. My family is from New York. So it's lots of West Indian and Caribbean culture there. Like, do you ever get people that reach back out to you and say, thank you for doing this work?
Yeah. Well, I've seen kids rush Reyna at many conferences, so she gets a lot of thank yous. So I will only speak for myself, but yeah, you know, it is very warming when people respond, and you're writing your truth, you're writing your history, you're writing our history, and people are learning. And, you know, I mean, even my own dad, you know, who's from Trinidad, born there, raised there, you know, educated there. And I didn't even know some of these things, you know, and, you know, and I've heard also from Americans who didn't know about Edward Rose, who didn't know, you know, that about certain histories out in the West. And yeah, it feels really good.
You know, From my end, I think there's a real difference between readers who grew up not in the United States, who are of Indian, South Asian origin, and then readers who grew up in the United States and spent a childhood here who are of South Asian origin. And I think that the type of research and the stories that are being told now have different meanings for those two different groups. A lot of the folks who may have grown up abroad and live here now, there's a knowledge of this population that lived here, and it's sort of like a factoid. There might be a little bit of pride in it, or there might even be a distancing between that population and themselves. For instance, a lot of that early population was forced to look outside of their own community to find spouses and to form families. And that's something that's contrary to I would say conventional South Asian culture. People prefer not to do that, or there's a lot of religious strictures around it. So the necessity of doing that is looked upon a different way than folks who had grown up here in the US and are eager to find their faces and their names, in the mythology of how America was formed. I mean, folks who grew up here have that need, like to look backwards and to see yourself there makes you belong to the country and the mythology of the country and the history of the country in a different way than if, you arrived here and you knew about the early settlers in a different way. So I see a real difference between these two categories of people, not all the time, but generally in the way that they receive these works of Western mythology. So I don't know if other folks have found that too, but that is something that I find curious, and yet I understand it from my own viewpoint, and from when I think of my parents and myself, it's very personal in my understanding of it as well.
Yeah. I mean, what I try to do with my books is to see each book as a celebration of being an immigrant. And instead of being ashamed of being an immigrant, I try to celebrate it. And in doing that, I managed to then help other people celebrate their immigrant identity, their immigrant experiences. And I always say, what's more American than the immigrant experience? Really, we try to shame immigrants, but the reality is that is the American experience is the immigrant experience. No matter what you call them, if you want to call them pilgrims, if you want to call them settlers or explorers, they're still immigrants. White people want to call themselves expats when they go live in another country. Guess what? You're an immigrant, not an expat. So,
Yes.
right? I mean, it's like the word immigrant takes on this very negative connotation, and there's just so much negativity associated with the word immigrant, and white people don't want to use it, right? They want to call themselves settlers and explorers and pilgrims and expats. They don't want to use the word immigrant, but so they just use that word for people of color. People of color are the ones who get called immigrants all the time.
Well, the immigrant and the enslaved.
Right.
All of
So
them come here voluntarily.
right. So we have to celebrate, right? We have to celebrate our identity, our community, and that's what I try to do with my books.
Reyna, do you think that's true about the word immigrant even a generation ago, or do you think that's more of a current phenomenon? I don't remember growing up in the 70s and 80s feeling that the word immigrant carried the same weight that it carries today.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's gotten worse now. Yeah, especially with our president, who is very determined in demonizing immigrants to the point where now the word immigrant has become, in a way, a negative word. And now I see more the word migrant being used, right? migrant instead of immigrant, to try to get away from that negativity that has been associated to the word immigrant. But there's also that argument of, refugees, right? That some people that are labeled immigrants, they're actually refugees, and we also don't want to use that word for some reason. But I always called myself an immigrant. I never thought of myself as a refugee until a few years ago. Viet Thanh Nguyen, the Pulitzer Prize winning writer, Viet Thanh Nguyen, a Vietnamese writer, he put together an anthology about refugees. He asked me to contribute an essay, and I said, but I'm not a refugee. And then he says, you're an economic refugee. Your family were economic refugees. I had never really thought of that, of using that word refugee. So he gave me another way to look at myself and at my family and our experiences. And it's true, we were economic refugees.
I'll also add something, I think it depends, the word immigrant and the connotation, I think has a lot to do, how you view that has a lot to do with sort of whether you're considered a model minority or not, and so I grew up also in the 70s and the 80s, and my parents being from, Trinidad, and, considered, nobody even knew what that country was where I was growing. I grew up in Baltimore. And I remember people looking down at us and feeling like, they because that we were strange, and, we had curry in our food, and what was coming out of my mother's kitchen was different from what everyone else, and my home experience was different. I didn't think the word immigrant was a good thing. I remember wanting so much to kind of just fit in. And not be seen as anything other than American. And it took me a long time, and well into my adult years to sort of, do what Reyna's talking about, this sort of celebration. And, my first book is about my grandmother coming to this country and making her way. And for all intents and purposes, she was an economic refugee, right? And so and she left her children behind, and and worked for $50 a week. And so my entire first book was this celebration of immigration, but against this idea that there was something unworthy about us.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, let's see, I'm trying to think of, I have other questions. There was one that I had that some of you had touched on already in talking about your novels. During your research, did you ever look around and like think like, how did I get here? Or did you find yourself really deep in something that you're like, how am I going to weave this into my story? Like Reyna, you mentioned the hangings of those Irish heroes, and I've never heard the story before. So were there moments like that where you came across something and you were like, what? How did we even get here?
I feel like the writing of my entire book was that experience. Like every 4 months I had something like that happen. I set out to write about these the early Punjabi farmers in Southern California. And then I found out, that was the time, when the Japanese ship Komagataru was trying to land in Vancouver and then was forbidden from landing and sent back to Calcutta. I thought I had to put that in there. And then I thought I'm going to be transversing that time when Bhagat Singh Thind had applied for American citizenship and then gained American citizenship and then lost it. And then all of the South Asians lost their land because, the status of a landholder was dependent on their citizenship. It happened to me over and over again about the South Asian soldiers who fought for the U.S. in the war, how many there were and how they were actually documented, and what they had to gain in terms of fighting for the U.S. and how they volunteered when they didn't have to for the U.S. Army. So my whole experience of writing this book was one moment like that out for
Yeah,
Mhm.
historical fiction feels like a one big rabbit hole.
him.
That's true. Yeah, because I I have found it to be really overwhelming, but I finally got to a point in my manuscript where the hardest part is behind me. Now I'm just trying to do all the little details that I haven't put in yet. I'm in a really good place in terms of where the book is at right now, but it was really overwhelming trying to do all the research when it came to the war itself, why the war happened, and reading about the war, but then I had to also read about the Texas Rebellion, which happened 10 years earlier, and the Mexican American War cannot be fully understood without also understanding what happened in Texas and how all these, white settlers came into Texas and just flooded the state and took over it and fought against the Mexicans to take Texas from it. So I had to do all the research. But what I found most overwhelming, and I was really, really scared of when I started this book, was how to capture the experience of an Irish soldier. What do I know about being Irish, and what do I know about being a soldier?
Yeah.
So I had to really learn all the vocabulary that he would know in terms of how to describe the battles. He's an artillerist, so I had to learn everything about cannons, and there's just so much that went into researching the book. But I feel so good about it because I really learned so much in this process of writing this novel. And yeah, I can't wait to share it with all of you.
I'm excited for it to be out into the world so I can read it. Um, One of the things that I've kind of noticed throughout the whole conversation is um, just the fluidity of language and words and how they change over the course of time. And from one thing to like talking about in Reyna's story, the Irish soldier, and how now Irish people are considered white. So like that one word white kind of sweeping all of these people into one category, or the word immigrant and how that's evolved over time. Um, I just I guess what I'm trying to what am I trying to ask? I guess what I'm trying to ask is I've I've lost it.
That's good.
I guess it's just an observation of the conversation and what you all think of that observation, as well as how the words evolve, how they change, how we
Mm-hmm.
look at things, how we look at stories, how will we look at these things maybe 20, 50 years from now. Do you all think about that when you're writing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
as far as I had known, Tamika, there had not been fictional treatment of this population before I started writing the book. And there had been some documentaries made of them, of this group of farmers, and there had been some sociological studies too. So I was very aware of, I was very conscious about it being the first fictional treatment. And you had asked earlier about whether I felt, whether there's an additional burden because we're filling in these stories now. And I felt the weight of the facts very heavily, and that I felt an additional responsibility to facts and what really happened, which is why I think I wove so many actual newspaper articles and real written documentation at that time into the story, because I felt like I don't have to say much more than what really happened in order to make a compelling story. But I don't know what that means, down the line. So say a generation from now, when there'll be other fictional treatments of this population, will there be more freedom to deal with the mythology of it and of that time? It's really interesting. question you present. And I also wonder, you know, another, on my down days, I would feel like no one's ever going to look at this stuff again. You know, this is going to be a window in time where people want to read these books, and then, you know, 20 years from now, we'll be on to the next thing, and they'll be buried. And then some, you know, some PhD candidate will come along, you know, in the 2050s and unearth all of this stuff that we're all writing now. So I don't know. I was always a teacher.
I want to say that won't happen, because I've witnessed, for example, Ya Gyasi's Homecoming.
Yeah.
Yes.
Homecoming.
Homecoming.
Yes. I've witnessed that become a part of so many curriculum bases, and I personally know a lot of like Black people, like in my own life, that have been, like, again, thirsting for stories and representations of what we actually experience, and our connection to the Ivory Coast. And so it's like, I feel like there is someone out there who's like, this story, this is my story. And it's like, if it's not being told, we have to kind of put it out there, even in the cases that, even though it's a fiction narrative, it feels very much like void filling for a lot of us. So I would hope that it still becomes a part of like base knowledge, because you, like you said, you put so many actual newspaper articles and factual things in there. Why can't it be something that is referred to, in the same way like our history books are referred to? Because some of that is it fact? Is it fact? We don't know. Lauren brought that up earlier. It's like, do you know what is fact? That was my timer going off, saying that we have 5 minutes, and I have 2 questions here. One of the questions say, I'd love to hear what Western books written by women each panelist recommends, aside from each other's, obviously.
Who's gonna go?
I have not gotten my hands on a book by a woman yet, and the research that I've been doing, they're all men.
Yeah, I like Louise Erdrich's books. She writes about the West a lot. Joy Harjo, you know, Natalie Diaz is a poet. She writes about the West. Percival Everett. Percival Everett. Sorry, he has this, and I'm going to blank on the name of this book, but he wrote this book set in Wyoming, about a Black man who, you know, has land out there, and it's just sort of a really, she said women. Did she say women?
Yeah, she said
right.
women.
I'm
no,
okay, never
yeah,
mind.
no.
All right, so I've named 3 women. There we go.
And there was another question that says, are there similarities between the West that you each wrote about in your novels to the West today? What threads or streams persist?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I think that it's hard for, you know, I grew up on the East Coast, so I'm going to say that I didn't grow up in the West. But what was interesting for me is that during my research, I traveled with a Crow Native American couple up to Bighorn Mountain, and they were sort of my guide, helping me sort of figure out where to locate certain parts of my story. And during, you know, my time with them, they talked a lot about sort of the discrimination Indigenous people face, even today, or face even today, you know, and sort of their own sort of stories of, you know, just living in Montana and what that felt like, living in their bodies and with their history. And I remember sort of being like, what? You know, like it was sort of an a real revelation for me to see that the kind of discrimination that they were talking about felt very much like the discrimination that Black people face and have been facing for, you know, many years in this country. And I think I was really surprised by it. But it also made me go back and revisit, you know, my own story to make sure that I was incorporating enough of that in you know, in the past, because it's still happening today. So I would say that, you know, the prejudices and are, you know, still resonant.
I had that experience too in the research that I'm doing. Lately, I've been reading a lot of diaries written by soldiers in the US Army. And it's so hard to read those diaries because they use really insulting language when they talk about Mexicans. You know, they call them the degenerate race, greasers, Mexicans, the filthy Mexican savages. So it's so hard for me to read these books and to see how even like the language that they use in the 1840s, it's still the same language that is being used today when, you know, for example, when Trump talks about Mexicans, right? So that to me has been really difficult.
I'm so sorry to be the person that has to step in, but we are out of time. And I just want to thank you all so much. What a rich, amazing panel and topic, and you're all so brilliant. So thank you for supporting independent bookstores and Independent Bookstore Day. Thank you to Mika. And books by all of the authors here are available at independent bookstores everywhere, either online or in person. So please, if you haven't checked them out, look, she's surrounded by them.
I'm at Bookstore now. Nobody else is.
So thanks again. Happy Independent Bookstore Day. And you guys are great.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Samantha.
you.
Thank you for the
Thank
invitation.
you.
Thank you.